All right, let's get started. On behalf of the Executives Club, thank you so much for joining us for Digital Shifts Are in Hyperdrive. Can healthcare keep up? We'd like to thank the sponsors of our Healthcare Forum event who are bringing this event to you today. It's Northwestern Medicine, United Healthcare, and ZS Associates. We thank them for their partnership and support of this programming. We have a lot to get to today, so without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Craig Bartholomew to give us some opening remarks for today's event. Over to you, Craig.
Hey, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our virtual healthcare forum event, Digital Shifts Are in Hyperdrive. Can healthcare keep up? I'm Craig Bartholomew, Executive Director of Illinois for United Healthcare and a co-chair of the Executives Club Healthcare Forum. As United Health Group is both a health benefits company through United Healthcare and a health technology company through Optum, this is a topic near and dear to our hearts. I'm excited to welcome you for a lively discussion focusing on how healthcare continues to adapt to our new reality and how even with the vaccine, people's behaviors have changed significantly. Today, we have an expert panel of industry leaders to provide firsthand insight on how digital tools and technologies are changing the practice and the delivery of healthcare. We encourage you to use the chat feature throughout this discussion to share thoughts with your fellow participants. We'll have time for audience questions at the end of our meeting. Please use the Q&A box if you would like to ask one of the panelists a question. Today, I'm excited to feature one of my fellow forum co-chairs, Nitin John, principal at ZS Associates, and today's moderator. After a presentation from Yash Papuri, Nitin will kick off the moderated discussion with our panel of experts. There's a lot to get into in the next hour, so thank you for joining us, and thank you to our speakers for taking the time out of your day to share your insights with us. Yash, over to you.
Many thanks, Craig. I am very excited to be part of this panel and to be part of this forum. And thank you for inviting me to this discussion. Let me quickly share my screen here. And just a quick check. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, thank you again, Craig. And just like that, we are in the middle of April of 2021. It has been about a year since the pandemic started. So what I'm going to be doing in the next, 10 or 15 minutes is to highlight some of the enduring, or at least trends that we think will endure well beyond the pandemic, with a focus on the digital trends and with a focus on the digital trends. All right, so without much further ado, I want to talk about two important topics. Given that we don't have the luxury of too much time, I will do a whirlwind tour of how the healthcare delivery landscape is rapidly evolving, and we'll do a light touch on the engagement preferences of providers, engagement preferences with pharma in particular. And now, while there are multiple interactions that are happening in the ecosystem, because we don't have too much time, I'd like to focus on the interaction between providers and pharma. Okay, so let me just jump in to the content. Just by way of context, ZS Associates has been pulsing the providers and patients during the pandemic to really understand the sentiments as well as the care continuum and the changes that are happening. And the results I'm going to be presenting are from the latest wave we fielded back in January, at the end of January and early February. And we are very thankful to our close to 1,200 respondents that included physicians from as many as 14 therapeutic areas, about almost 600 patients and about 100 otherwise healthy individuals. So quite a diversity there in terms of the respondents. Okay. All right. So without much further ado, what did we hear from our respondents? Firstly, on the physicians' side, we heard lingering concerns about capacity limitations as we went into the pandemic-related lockdowns, and as things started warming up, close to 50% of physicians indicated that they are now facing capacity limitations. And a similar proportion also indicated staffing challenges, with some of their non-essential staff going on furloughs And of course, a lot of them expressed concerns on the financial health of their practices, especially the smaller practices, right? Now, on the patient side, we saw an interesting dichotomy of sentiments. On one hand, we saw that over 3/4 of the patients said that they were very concerned about actually going to the physician's office in person for fear of COVID-19 exposure. But then, almost half of the patients, about 42% of patients, indicated that they're not confident that their physicians can deliver care remotely, right? And so when you put these two sort of counterbalancing factors together, you might surmise that there might be some amount of inertia, at least among certain patient populations, to seek care actively. And this is a point that we all as a healthcare community need to keep in mind and think about activating that portion that may be, for one reason or the other, subject to inaction, and therefore leading to broader suboptimal societal health outcomes. Okay. Now, the concerns on the patient side are by no means uniform. We are seeing interesting differences in these concerns based on age lines as well as ethnic and racial lines. On the age lines, you will see that the older patients over 65 years, are not as comfortable using telehealth or digital health resources, as demonstrated by the 61 and 49%, indicating that they're highly likely to use telehealth. Okay, and then on the ethnic side, on the ethnic and racial divide, we are seeing clear indications of racial and ethnic minorities not being as comfortable seeking medical care in person during and potentially even after the pandemic. So now more than ever, the social determinants of health are critical. And this also has implications as to how we address healthcare delivery. A lot of healthcare will continue to be local. Understanding the dynamics of the patients, the racial mix, the age mix of those local patient populations is going to be very critical as we go forward. Okay, so what is the implication to the numbers and the so-called treatment journey, or the patient funnel, as we like to call it? What we saw is, back in the dark days of the pandemic, almost a year ago, in April 2020, the patient visits, which is the top of that funnel that you're seeing there, were down by 35% compared to pre-COVID levels, right? And the great news is that that has since rebounded. And back in October 2020, that number was only down by 9% compared to pre-COVID levels. Now, the not so good news is that we seem to be stuck there at the 9% since October 2020. And even in February, when we did this pulse, that number was, again, very, very rigid at 9% down compared to pre-COVID levels. So, it is possible that we may have hit a ceiling that, at 10%, that 10% of patient population may have been suppressed from seeking healthcare, whether it is because the patients are spacing out their visits a lot more, or whether it is because they are altogether not seeking proactive care. I think this is a point that we all need to keep in mind as we move forward and emerge from the pandemic. Now, the way care is being sought is also evolving in very interesting ways. So again, back in April 2020, over a third of patient visits were in person, just over a third. And that has since gone up to almost 2/3 in January and February 2021. So if you look at the mix of remote versus in-person consultations, the mix has literally flipped. Now, however, when we talked to our physicians and asked how they anticipate this mix emerging into the future, they indicated that about 20% of all patient visits will continue to be remote, even post-COVID-19. And that majority of these remote visits will be follow-up appointments, not necessarily new patient visits or new diagnosis-related visits, but follow-up visits. right? Which is where telehealth and telemedicine might have a big role to play. We can also surmise that diseases with a long patient journey pre-diagnosis might be really fertile ground for remote consultations in the future, especially because there will be a lot of follow-up conversations before a diagnosis is actually made, right? The other aspect is, as patients warm up to remote consultations, we might see an uptick in remote monitoring solutions, or what we like to call beyond the pill solutions, beyond the medicine solutions. Once you take the medicine, what happens then? How do you keep tabs on how the patient is responding? How do you keep tabs on the side effect profiles? And so that is another area where we feel might become a lot more prominent in the days to come. Okay. Lastly, I will just point to some interesting trends or preferences we are hearing from physicians about the way they would like to engage with pharma in particular. So what you're seeing here is across 14 specialties, the black dots indicate the proportion of visits that are remote, the proportion of rep engagement, sales rep engagements between physicians and sales reps today, right? So that's the black dot. And then the orange dots are where physicians anticipate or prefer that these interactions will be in the post-COVID world. And you see that even though the proportion of remote visit in the future is going down, it is still a very healthy 50%. Now, at least this is preference from the physician side. It's not. It's obviously not the actual number, because this is all future. But this presents interesting challenges and opportunities for pharma to think about how they communicate the impact and the value of drugs to patients via the providers in a world where providers increasingly want these interactions to be remote, right? And it has implications for sizing, structure, incentivization, and of course, training of the field persona as they interact with physicians. So that's really the summary of the results that we have. I will pause here and see if there are any questions in the chat or Q&A. And maybe Megan or others, if you see any Q&A questions that I can answer, I'd be happy to at this point.
Yash, I think we'll do the Q&A at the end, so I'll keep you posted.
Perfect. So Nitin, over to you then.
Okay, super. Thank you, Yash. Thank you everyone for joining. I wanted to first start with the framing of the panel. And of course, there is a lot that we can talk about post-COVID. The one theme that we have chosen is, let's think 3 years out or 5 years out. So we're not talking about the immediate near term, but we're talking about somewhat medium term. And secondly, we are talking about digital trends. So that's the other focus that we have chosen. And I'm super excited to have perspectives from a physician from Northwestern Memorial, and we'll go through the introduction shortly, from a payer, from a pharmaceutical manufacturer, as well as from a company that's leading in AI in healthcare. So really diverse group. I'll try to do the best in 30 minutes or so to bring flavors of digital in various different forms. But just to begin, let's start with a quick introduction. I'm Nitin Jain. I'm a partner here at ZS. ZS is a global consulting firm specializing in healthcare. And I'm based here in Chicago, and I'm one of the co-chair for the executive club. Dr. Durman, over to you for a quick introduction.
Sure, thank you. My name is Daniel Durman. I'm a practicing internist at Northwestern Memorial. In my administrative role, I'm the Chief Innovation Executive for the healthcare system, which Telehealth folded under that. And for those of you that are our patients and had a great experience getting a vaccine, then I'm also in charge of vaccine distribution. For those of you that are one of our patients and couldn't get in to get a vaccine, then I have nothing to do with it.
With that, Eric, to you.
Thanks, Nitin. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm the Market Chief Medical Officer for United Healthcare for employer and individual for the state of Illinois. I'm a pediatrician by training with over 20 years experience practicing in the northwest suburbs of Chicago.
Thank you. Elias?
Hi, everyone. My name is Elias Khalil. I'm the Vice President of Global Commercial Services for Eli Lilly.
And Nikki?
Hi, I'm a molecular genetic pathologist by training, and I'm at Tempest running translational medicine.
Super. So thank you all, and Yash is also part of the panel. I have about 5 or 6 different questions, and I'll kind of follow that treatment funnel, so to speak, that Yash was using. And my first question for you is really on consumerization. And as we think about our day-to-day lives as consumer, things have gotten a lot easier. I think there is a notion of more personalization. As a consumer, I can look at different options, I can compare. Information is just available a lot easier, but that's not the case in healthcare. So Eric, I'm gonna start with you to maybe paint a picture that's 3 or 5 years out on what might that vision look like.
Thanks so much. So you're right. Right now, your access to information with regard to your healthcare benefits, your medical records are still very much compartmentalized based on where you get that care or where you purchase your care from. I think the future is going to be a combining of that data into a single user interface, and we're seeing that happen more and more as you can, share data from one health system to the next. So I think better access to information, not only your medical records and your benefits, those of us that remember actually reading through a benefit document when they got their health insurance, those days are over. Now there are apps and websites that really help you find out what's covered, what's not covered, and transparency of cost. I think it's going to take a few years before we really feel, that we have true cost transparency up front, but that's something that's definitely evolving. I think the other major change in health insurance that we're seeing is the ability to buy more insurance when you need it. So that on-demand health insurance, which we're seeing certain products like Bind show us that access to unique healthcare. I think the other thing that you described from a consumerization standpoint is obtaining care where and when you want it. And it is definitely taking both the payer and the provider to be involved in that conversation. And it is going to take both going forward. We're going to get away from more episodic care. I decided I needed care. There's going to be more data to help you decide when you need care. And some of that is still screenings, but there's also going to be more care that comes from monitoring. We already have Apple Watches that can tell us if we have an abnormal heart rhythm. I think there's going to be more in our lives that tells us, hey, you may need to go see your doctor. And I think COVID accelerated that. We saw some countries using even sanitation water to determine whether there were COVID outbreaks in certain communities. I can see, applications like that, even to the point where, should your toilet tell you should go see your gastroenterologist, those are the things of the future, wearables and predictive healthcare.
Thank you. Are there some sort of initiatives at United, Eric, that you would be comfortable sharing?
Sure. So remote patient monitoring is something that we're doing very aggressively in the Medicare space right now in a program called Vivify. And that is still active patient participation. You use a blood pressure monitor at home, you use a glucose monitor, you have a scale, a spirometer, and that data gets fed to your physician. More passive type monitoring, we have disease reversal programs for type 2 diabetes that now we have type 2 diabetics wearing continuous glucose monitors, which we traditionally would think of in the type 1 space, where that data is constantly being fed into the program to help determine how best to modify your medication regimen or your meal planning to actually try to reverse type 2 diabetes. So those are some initiatives now. There are wearable devices that we are working on using after discharge, where we can monitor things like temperature, respiratory rate, your cough frequency. Soon the device will be able to monitor whether you're moving or not. So, you know, if you're post-operative, you're supposed to be up 3 times a day. Are you getting up 3 times a day? It can really help speed up the transition to being at home too. So a lot of it is at home. There's so much data that says that the more care you get at home, the less you're likely to be readmitted. You eat better, you sleep better, and that transition of care is better for your health.
Great, thank you so much. Elias, similar question to you from a Lilly perspective, this idea of patient experience, making it easy for the patient. What are your thoughts?
I mean, we've been working on how do we provide a better experience for the patient, but we're also, like many of you, we're realizing that we're not the solution. We're not the only solution. We're part of the solution and part of a network. And I think the focus right now has been on figuring out what is the life flow of the patient and how do we fit in within the life flow of the patient. Thinking that every patient would want to have a relationship with the manufacturer. So you build like a whole infrastructure for a patient to only deal with you, when typically a patient is dealing with several, sometimes disease areas and is taking several medications. He can't be working with several platforms. So the question is, how can we work with the whole healthcare system and provide our solutions within the life flow of the patients and also within the workflow of the physicians? Because a lot of times the care and the information happens through an intermediary, and you can't ask the physicians to, let's say, drop EHR and go somewhere else to get the information. So the more integration, the more transparency, the better from an outcomes perspective.
Super, thank you. My second question, Dr. Durman, I'll start with you. I think you have been as close as any on the telehealth topic. So a two-part question on telehealth. I know we saw a big spike right after COVID. Those numbers have come down. So your longer term projection on telehealth is my first question. And my second question for you is, I know Eric talked a little bit about remote monitoring, but wellness. What can we do about not even getting sick? And again, the role of digital if we were to talk a few years out. So love your perspective on both of those.
Yeah, sure. So we did stabilize now. We're probably somewhat short of 25%. We're probably at about 20% of our visits are telehealth. If I were to predict, I would say that the curve is going to go down a little bit more before it starts back up again. The going back up again will probably be a little bit a shared responsibility between the patients being receptive and asking for it, and us being able to provide the right kind of milieu and technology that makes it easy. If you think about banking as an analogy, or buying something, a consumer good, it's very, very easy now. As typical with healthcare, we don't make anything easy for anybody. So I think figuring out how to push the easy button for people is going to be very important. Being able to dump out of, so to speak, the telehealth and go to the live convert is also going to be very important. So we have a way to go to figure it out to make it an easier experience, but I think that patient experience has become very important. I just want to touch on one other thing. Eric did a very nice job of kind of articulating some stuff with remote patient care, and he'll touch a little bit of what you're talking about with wellness as well, or sort of the predictive nature of impending problems. Just a very quick story on congestive heart failure. We thought we were very slick 7 and 8 years ago when we figured out how to remotely measure someone's weight. Everyone knows or believes that weight is an important factor for somebody tipping over and getting a recurrence of or a reactivation of congestive heart failure. It turns out that it's a rather crude and unsophisticated way, and actually a laggard indicator of congestive heart failure rather than a leading indicator. For instance, what might be more important is the day-to-day changes within a person's own baseline. So for instance, pulse. If we know what your baseline pulse is, and now over several days, your pulse goes up by 20%, that may actually be an indicator 2 weeks prior to the weight going up. So this idea of using remote patient monitoring to predict is, I think, going to become very, very valuable going forward. I think the general theme would be in telehealth is, if I were broaden it out, and again, Eric touched upon this, I really think it's giving people what they want, when they want it, how they want it, and where they want it. And our ability to respond to that is going to really set the tone going forward. In the wellness space particularly, I've always been challenged, or for those of you representing corporate industry employment, you've realized that it's been very difficult over time to separate the wheat from the chaff on what's important for wellness. So there's an awful lot of things going on there with apps and digital technology to wellness. The question is, which of those are important and which of those have staying power in that regard? So I think as a classic Western trained people, we're probably going to back into it with a bit of a more disease perspective than I feel comfortable with, but we probably start with disease monitoring and understanding and predictiveness of that, and working our way towards being relevant in people's lives for wellness. Of course, everyone's definition of wellness is different. You know, for many people, the definition is trying to achieve the greatest health you can with the series of conditions or situation you have. So a diabetic wellness is different than a 60-year-old marathoners without any underlying diseases for wellness.
Great. No, very well said on both the topics. To my panel team, anything else to add to what Dr. Durman was saying?
Yeah, Nitin, I would just like to add that on the topic of beyond the medicine, I think the focus was always there to provide services beyond the medicine, even before the pandemic, but the pandemic catalyzed, and both Eric and Dr. Durman touched on these aspects. I'd say that some interesting examples that have emerged include home diagnosis, particularly for severe acute conditions. Eric is here from United Healthcare. I know United Healthcare pioneered some, at-home kits for hepatitis C, for example, for their Medicare Advantage patients. So that sort of innovation has been catalyzed during this period, which I think is a great outcome for healthcare overall.
Great, thank you, Yash. So I wanted to start with you, Elias, on the role of the manufacturer. And historically, the role of the manufacturer has been creating the pill, so to speak. And this thing called digital has been on the side. How do you see the role of the manufacturer changing in the future? And what's in it for the patient as you are changing?
Yeah. Honestly, if you think of COVID as kind of an event in history, I think it will change the world order. It will change everything in our day-to-day life. But if we back up to before COVID, we know that if every patient took the prescription that was prescribed and stuck to the regimen, we would save on average every year 125,000 lives and $300 billion, right? We know we have a problem of adherence, which translates into a problem of outcomes. So you can't just produce the molecule or the biology, whether it's a small molecule or a big molecule, put it in a pill or a device, and then put it out on the market. The question is, how do we collectively drive outcomes? So it's no longer an option of just doing you have to improve the human condition. If you want to improve the human condition, you have to present the solution in a holistic way. And I go back to, this is not only about pharma, it's about all the players in this, because we all approach it differently, but we have the same interest. And I think COVID proved that when we put our force together, we can make significant improvement. I mean, we're now looking at probably by the end of the summer to emerge into a new normal, whatever that normal will be. That wouldn't have happened if we didn't all join forces to improve the human condition during the pandemic. I think this needs to continue going forward. The more collaboration, the better.
Yeah, great. Nikki, anything to add from your side?
Yeah, so I think that technology can accelerate that feedback loop of discovery. So the more data we have around these problems, and again, we heard a lot of great anecdotes about using monitoring, but you can also mine data out of the health record, of course, and all of that can feed back to the pharma companies, and you get this virtuous cycle of accelerating discovery.
So I think a good segue in terms of data, as well as the leading indicator on the congestive heart failure example that Dr. Durman was giving, I wanted to talk about precision medicine, and we can even broaden it a little bit to the role of data, role of artificial intelligence in healthcare, especially in areas like oncology, where I know Tempus is doing a lot of work in bringing that precision medicine to reality. Nikki, I wanted to ask you on what is one of your favorite or thing that excites you the most, something that you're working on.
One of the things that we're working on and I'm very excited about is using multimodal data to look at outcomes for immuno-oncology therapies, basically for immunotherapies. And one of the problems that we're trying to solve is that existing biomarkers just aren't very precise for this. So pathology in the past has leaned really heavily on immunohistochemical stains, but it's somewhat of a blunt instrument. It was the best technology we had when it was developed, but we can do better than that. And as we have digitization of slides, that's a very rich source of data that scientists can use to develop algorithms and go beyond what the human eye can do. And in particular, if you start to layer molecular data on top of that, you can get much more sophisticated multimodal predictions. So you can look at, let's say, an immunohistochemical stain, you can look at an AI prediction, image analysis prediction, you can add RNA expression analysis, and then if you have the clinical record at your disposal, you can do the sort of data mining and clinical outcome correlation on a larger scale. And I think all of that together can really push us beyond what we've done in the past in terms of these fairly blunt and biomarkers that lack accuracy and precision.
Great. And if you were to think maybe a few years out, this is an example of what you're doing that excites you. But if you were to think about this idea of data, technology, digital, 3 years out, 4 years out, can you paint a vision of something that might come in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I would throw the question back to Elias as well. I think that that's sort of what I would like to see is that sort of data feeding back into pharma development efforts. Right now, I think we can use it to better tailor patient care, but ideally we'd want it to improve the whole pipeline from start to finish. And I think also that once that concept has been proven, then, cleaning up data, it sounds really easy, but it's actually really difficult and tedious and not glamorous at all. And people don't like to do it. So I think that if we can show proof of concept that this really can advance healthcare, then that might break down some of the barriers and make people more willing to say, okay, how do we structure medical records in a way that they can be more easily accessed for machine learning and et cetera.
And maybe I'll add one more thing that, downstream, this will also transform the value discussion, right? If you know what you're looking for and you can predict the outcome, you have more precision medicine, then you can have better predictive outcomes, then you can better quantify the value. So it impacts the whole cycle, but I cannot emphasize more than Nikki on the importance of data and how do we deal with data and clean the data. There is a lot of data. The question is how do we clean it and put it and structure it in different ways so that we could mine it and leverage it. It has proven to be very tough for us. It takes a lot of work and it's not glamorous and it costs money to have the right infrastructure set up. So.
Great. So just a quick reminder to our audience, we're going to continue with the panel for another 10 minutes or so. 10 to 15 minutes, but please submit your questions in the Q&A, and we'll cover them in the last 10 or 15 minutes. Dr. Durman, I wanted to hear from you as a provider, and I know AI in healthcare could be a topic in itself that we could spend hours, but any quick observations from your vantage point?
Yeah, I guess let me try to make it very simple. So you may come to me because you believe I'm an astute diastatistician. And if you're in a cocktail party, you tell someone, I love my doctor because he was able to figure this out or that out. When you think about it, relying on my acumen is actually a pretty scary thought, not just me in particular, but why in the world would we rely on someone's book smart or ability to recall or their ability to put the puzzle together when we have tools that can find signals that are very challenging for the average doctor or even the brilliant doctor house to figure out what those signals are. So from a very practical standpoint, I should be able to mine the data of my patients to present to both me and the patients a path forward or a tip-off as to something going on. So in a very practical way, we're starting to use these tools to be able to mine the electronic medical record and to really help guide our patients and our providers with a path to help diagnose or tip off if something goes off the rails. So, this idea of, everyone says it as opposed to artificial, but augmented intelligence, same thing on the radiology side. We have the ability to comb through thousands and thousands of x-rays and already find that the algorithms, we did a study together with Google at Northwestern that looked at mammograms and found, and chest x-rays, that found that by using the AI platform and machine learning platform, we were able to find and diagnose a lesion a full 12 to 16 months before the naked eye of the radiologist typically would find it. So those are the kind of applications that have everyday really exciting potential.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. So we're leading naturally, and there are some questions that are coming from the audience on data. And a lot of the data is not easy to do the kinds of things we're talking about, whether it's exchanging data across organizations, whether it's quality of data, whether it's the unstructuredness of the data. And a question that came up from the audience is even limitations such as Hipaa on what can you do with the data. So maybe Yash, I'll start with you. It's a loaded question. Maybe you could talk about promise and best practices that you're seeing, as well as any perspectives of barriers.
Absolutely. So let me start with this problem of sharing data across constituents, Nitin. We heard multiple aspects that Dr. Durman, Elias highlighted on how data can be exchanged between patients and physicians, right? Particularly remote monitoring data. The problem, as I see it, is not so much the availability of data as much as orchestration of all of it, right? For the important constituents. How do you put it all in a packaged form such that both physicians and patients can use it, right? And then how do you make meaningful sort of conclusions from it? So we are seeing some off-the-shelf solutions develop from startup technologies that do precisely that, right? So that's on the physician and patient angle. Then there is the emergence of alternate sites of care, right? As patients want to seek care from locations closer to their home or even remotely, this aspect of coordination across electronic medical records becomes ever more critical. For a patient seeking care from one health system versus the other, how do you make sure that these two medical record systems are talking to each other? Right now, that process has been all over the place. And again, we are seeing the emergence of solutions that are able to work with multiple health systems and orchestrate all of that, right? And I feel like that'll become even more of a trend as we emerge from the pandemic. Then I think there was a second aspect to your question, which was around Hipaa concerns. Is that right? Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Hipaa concerns, have by and large been scaled. I'd invite the other panelists to weigh in on this, right? Because we are not specifically going into any one particular patient to understand the correlation between disease progression and the markers of that disease. It is typically analyzed over multiple patients to come up with that correlation. So I feel like there are ways to get around it and actually make it meaningful to individual patients. But I'd like to hear from the other panelists as well.
Well, I would say not to get too far into the weeds on the Hipaa question, but it is an example. I'm not saying Hipaa isn't important, but it's an example of where there's where it's not easy, where it creates friction in the system. So I've had to learn way more about this than I ever wanted to, but there are 18 markers that you have to take out of the patient record to consider it truly de-identified. And one of them is precise dates. So then we have an issue where we're trying to see, okay, you give a drug and we want to know what the outcome is and what amount of time. And then we have, I don't know how many programmers and data scientists trying to figure out how to back into it with these imprecise dates. And it's something like, do we really need to make it that hard? I mean, you're in a sense, you're then limiting it to people or organizations that it can invest a ton of money and hire lots of people. And that's not how you move quickly.
Dr. Durman, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add, we're pursuing a novel approach, which is the use of synthetic data. So we're working with a young company that has created an algorithm using, instead of Daniel Durman, it creates Daniel Berman, and it's each individual record that's created does not match, but when you look at a whole population, statistically, it's exactly like the real population. And by using synthetic data, our ability to share across systems. So for instance, we could pass off to pharma or work with pharma and create a whole synthetic data set of 1 million patients where we're not crossing over into Hipaa and into real data. And if it looks, we ask a question, and if it looks promising, we can always toggle back to the real data and then go through all the jumps and hoops that Nikki was talking about that are related to that. So we think there's some real promise there. At the end, Hipaa was created actually many years ago now, and it's a different world now, and the parameters around it and the regulations around it probably don't make sense for today. So I think we're going to see something that looks very different 5 years from now.
Okay. Elias, Eric, anything to add from your side? Okay, so my last question for the panel is role of the government, regulation, policy, our favorite topic. And I've chosen to maybe limit it to say signs of hope. So as we are talking about the digital acceleration, all of these things that we have discussed so far in the panel, what gives you hope that we are moving in the right direction as it relates to that? And maybe Eric, I'll start with you.
Well, I think the one thing that COVID really accelerated was the payers and CMS, being serious about how they want to reimburse for telehealth. And I think, as you can see from this discussion, telehealth is yesterday, right? So what's coming, and I don't think that health systems or payers or anybody is going to put up with the lack of continued progress towards, large data analysis, like we talked about, continuous patient monitoring. We need to, see regulations that allow the ability for that blurring of the line between large payers and large health systems, whoever has the ability to manage that volume of data, but still be able to drill it back down to the PCP. So I think that's opening that up, and physicians recognizing that there's an openness to reimbursement, that it's not a barrier for them to be able to keep their practices open is I think the shining star.
Great. So I think with that, thank you first of all. I think we're tracking on time. I would maybe ask a couple of questions that have come from the audience, but thank you so much to the entire panel. So one of the questions that has come up is, Elias, I'll start with you. The question is, because of COVID, do you think the pharma supply chain will evolve? Right now, we're aware that the medicine has risk shipping to the individuals outside of temperature guidelines, et cetera. But it's a supply chain related question, and I don't know if you have any perspectives to share on that one.
I think the supply chain exists. It's not impossible. It's happening today, right? Even like with temperature sensitive medication that you want to ship home, this is today happening. Many of the pharmacies do ship directly to your address, and now Amazon has started. We have few of our products that are cold chain products that are being dispensed via that channel. We also have experimented, we obviously with a company like our size and the number of physicians we have and the way the system works and the importance of sometimes samples to start the patients, we have gone from predominantly our samples being delivered by our reps to going fully direct to physicians. And that brought its own set of challenges. How do you keep the temperature control, the right temp tails, and monitor the supply chain from A to Z? And we did it, I think, in a matter of days. So I think the supply chain downstream, I think this is solved. It's probably more also the behavior. I usually stop by the pharmacy around the corner and I pick up my prescription. That's a behavior that I have that we could probably change. But also, I think more importantly, that COVID poses the question of what do we do upstream? Medications are not manufactured in one site. And we have sites, for example, in Europe that do the formulation and we ship it all the way from Europe to the US where we assemble it. So when the supply chain was disturbed, we had to go all the way to chartering planes on a weekly basis so we don't interrupt the supply of medications to patients. And I think I haven't heard of any incident, not within the but within the industry where there was a shortage of medication, which I think proves that there is some sort of resiliency. But of course, we're asking ourselves the question, what if, because this is part of business continuity plan, and we did not assume that global travel will be disrupted or the local flying and the supply chain will be disrupted. So we're all asking the questions and doing our own assessments.
Great, thank you. Eric, there is a question for you. You talked about on-demand health insurance. And the question is, where do you see the trend for that and implications for both the customer as well as healthcare companies?
Yes, I think, when you underwrite an insurance plan, there's disease states and acute situations that are taken account for in the actuarial data. And so what on-demand health plans do is they strip away some of the more episodic things, especially in and around surgical and interventional care. So I need a hip replacement, I need a knee replacement. These are not things that occur acutely. It's not taking away your ability to obtain emergent health care, but you can plan and purchase up the episodic care that you need on top of your standard plan. And it's a cost savings means that can reduce costs both to the consumer and to the employer that I think is unique. And I think we will see more of that. We certainly want to keep the safety net of everything that you need from an emergent standpoint, everything that you need from a preventive standpoint. Those should never be things that fall into the buy-up situation where acutely you're making a decision. These are the planned out experiences in life that you still need to have, but you don't need to pay for if you don't run into it.
Great. Another question, a lot of you talked about the power of partnership, and it's beyond your company. It's really the whole ecosystem has to come together. Would any of you like to share a favorite story of something since COVID started of impact that was created through that partnership?
I suppose I can offer a perspective, Nitin, there. I'd like to go back to the example of home diagnosis that I was alluding to earlier. I think COVID has accelerated, or rather refocused, pharma companies in particular from focus on medicine to focus on experience, right? And a good example that comes to my mind where partnerships were instrumental is making the entire journey seamless. So starting with home diagnosis kits where a patient with an acute disease doesn't even have to leave the comfort of their living room and they self-diagnose. And then they're connected to a telehealth platform where they're talking to a doctor, a physician, to talk about their condition and then get a quick prescription. And then there is another partner involved where that last mile of prescription to fulfillment is also being completed. So from the patient's perspective, this is extremely seamless. But if you think about that ecosystem, there's a pharma company, there's the supply chain company, there may be retail pharmacies, right? And of course, there are technology companies that are developing these home diagnosis kits. So that's one example where I thought orchestration came to play through partnerships.
Perhaps I can offer another example. Obviously we had a solution, or we had the antibody when that came out first before the vaccines, and that was kind of the first solution. But under an EUA, you're like restricted with, the communication that you could do and how do you spread the message out. And we've partnered with government in order to try and spread the word. I mean, it has improved since when we first made it available to now. That's an example that usually you don't see a lot of this kind of collaboration existing, but also within the industry, you see a lot of pharma companies working together to use their own manufacturing platforms to ramp up production of solutions. That's not what you see or what you saw typically on a day-to-day basis, correct? So that's I think these are examples on potential collaboration that we could see more of post-COVID.
Yash, from my world, I find it fascinating with my innovation hat on that we did things in the course of 3 to 4 weeks that normally take us a year or longer to do. So if you talk about the residual of COVID, one of my challenges is to figure out how we can capture that in a bottle and continue that. And along the line, some of the partnerships that we did, everybody kind of brought to the table the ability to strip away anything that wasn't essential to get it done. And I think all of us stepped back and said, wow, that's unbelievable. And, I laugh as we start falling back into our old patterns. And one of my challenges and goals is to try to figure out how we can capture that going forward. And I'm sure everyone around the table, not only on the panel, but in the audience as well, experience the same thing. And we kind of realize the difference between what were real barriers and what were the artificial bureaucracies that we all had.
So that's a perfect segue to a question, and I'll pose it as a statement because we're running out of time. The question was really speed. And for example, Lilly, the antibody treatment came up in a matter of a few months, the speed of vaccination, what Dr. Durman just talked about of bottling the learning. So it was posed as a question of what are those learnings? I think we're running out of time, but I'll leave it as there is something there for us to make sure we don't lose and we keep working that muscle in the future. So with that, thank you again to my esteemed panel. I'll pass it on to Brian for the closing remarks.
Thanks, Nathan.
Brian, you're on mute.
I'm on mute.
Yeah,
all right. So
you.
For those of you who don't know, I'm Brian Walsh. I'm the Vice President of Managed Care at Northwest Memorial. We had a great discussion today. I'm the co-chair of the committee. I want to thank the presenters. It was a great discussion. So a virtual round of applause for everything they did for us. I think a couple of takeaways as I listened to this. The one thing that struck me is a lot of this technology is wonderful and will work well, but I wonder how we make sure we don't lose the underserved population in this, because a lot of what we're talking about are people who have access to the internet and access to these things that allow them to interact with their physicians, whether it's virtually or wearable devices. I think we saw throughout the pandemic that generally underserved populations lag behind, whether it was getting testing, getting the vaccination itself. So I think as healthcare leaders really need to consider how we, as we move forward in this technology age, how we make sure we don't leave those underserved populations behind and create a bigger gap in healthcare between kind of the haves and the haves not. So I think that'll be interesting. Hopefully you all found this information useful and you can carry it forward as you move forward this week in your jobs. You hope that as you look at this, we can find ways to make this work better for us as you move forward. So I'd also like you to keep an eye on the Executive Club website. We have some upcoming virtual programs beginning April 21st with the real estate forum, where the CEO of Lincoln Yards, Andrew Glore, will be there to give us an update on what's going on in real estate. You can sign up at the Executive Club website for that. Other than that, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you for joining us. Unless there's other comments, I think we're going to wrap up here.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.